also with Martin Pringle. So I think we probably should lead off with kind of some recent information that we've received, because some of you may decide that you have other things to do. So Steve, would you like to tell them what the information is that we received about funding at this point?
Yeah, I definitely will. And if you're not watching the news right now, I'll be careful how I approach this. The SBA has stopped taking applications. I told these guys we don't want to start panic because the way you should view it, if you've already gotten your SBA loan number back from your banker, your funds are secured. But the SBA, the $349 billion that was allotted, has been spoken for. So as of this morning, and in fairly new news, they have stopped taking new applications. As we talked about before, there's a trans system where you put it into the SBA, and that will not even accept applications at this point. So depending on what your banker's message is to you, the applications are staying in line. We're all in hopes and being told that there could be more funding. You've heard up to $250 billion is what Congress is discussing. But again, we don't want to overpromise to anybody. As far as we know, that has not been approved at this point. But we're all hopeful that that will be in fairly short order.
Right. And I might add to that, since this will be really a new piece of legislation, we don't know even what the terms are. They may change some of the rules that we've been so hopeful that we could really understand, notwithstanding all the changes. But I think our encouragement from the entire panel is continue to, if you're trying to put paperwork together to make applications and all, Steve, wouldn't you suggest that they use the same forms that their banks have provided to them? I know some people have struggled to figure out, do they qualify? Do they not qualify? Do they have partners that qualify? Are they too big? Are they too little? All these things that keep changing. Don't you think it'd be a good idea if people still would like to pursue it, hoping that there's additional funding?
I would encourage everybody to go through the process with your banker, because there's a chance for them to help you catch empty spots. And we want to do our customers a service and get all of that taken care of, hoping that 250 billion additional goes in and we've got you in line that way. So I would definitely, and the 1099s and self-employed have only been able to apply for a short period. So I would say definitely, if you're working with a banker, continue in the process.
Right. Yeah. Like 1099s have only been available this week.
Right.
Yeah. So, all right. No, I think that's good advice for everybody. And so we will go ahead and touch on some of the questions that people raised on that. But again, keep in mind, and this thing is so fluid. As you know, we keep getting this series of final interim rules that are final today, and then they call them the same thing and they change them and issue them again the following day. So it's such a moving target that our encouragement is everybody keep doing what you're doing, work with your banks, and hopefully they'll open it up again soon. Steve, can you give us some idea, just with CrossFirst, how many applications you received and how many received the SBA numbers?
Well, we're in the hundreds in in the several hundreds, and our approvals that we got through, because the bulk did come in, and I think probably most of our audience would see that the bulk came in the first week or so. So highest percentage, we did get approvals. I don't want to make folks, the challenge is, like we said before, it's a lot of the 1099s. There were several changes that we were going to discuss today that happened over this last week, which opened it up for some new applicants. It was real. We were starting to see it, trickle down to fewer numbers, less than probably 100 in the waiting list right now that we're having to have tough conversations with. And again, I'd remind people that the SBA number, you may have gotten approval. Your banker probably communicated back with you that you got an SBA number, loan number. That means that your funds are spoken for, even though now all banks have 10 days, calendar days, to fund that money to you, depending on how you ask for the funds. But
right.
just because you don't have the dollars today doesn't mean you won't, as long as you got that SBA number.
Sure. So Steve, if somebody hasn't heard from their banker and they're anxious about it, they can call them, right?
I would call them because we realized, and again, I don't want to speak for all bankers, but we're proactively reaching out to folks that were on the list, letting them know what, if they made it in or not, or what position they're in.
Right. Yeah. Do you want me to give everybody your cell number?
I do not, but
Okay.
got several bankers in the building that would love to hear from you, though.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. All right. Well, hey, listen, all joking aside, let's go ahead and continue with what we are planning to talk about today. So the PPP program, as we just said, we're going to encourage everybody to continue to hope that there's going to be more funds that come through. So John, would you mind taking a little bit of time and kind of updating everybody on what we've seen here on the PPP so that they have the most recent information?
Sure, George. Yeah, I think Kate's maybe going to share, or I've just got some brief slides just so you can see what I'm going to try and cover. And basically, I'm going to talk a little bit about funding, which that got preempted by things that happened this morning. I actually updated that first section of bullet points this morning, and then I would have updated again but I had a chance right before we started because article I read this morning said that of the 349 billion, 324 had already been spoken for as of 9 p.m. last night. Well, as we just learned, the SBA has stopped taking applications, which means all 349 billion has been allocated. If you think about it, that's just a little less than 2 weeks after companies or organizations could first apply on Friday the 3rd. And dropping down a little bit there, self-employed individuals, 1099s, the recipients could just start applying last Friday. And even then, I know several lenders who weren't accepting their applications just because they didn't have any guidance. They didn't know how to calculate things. And so it's very unfortunate that a lot of those self-employed individuals, Schedule C people, sole proprietors, didn't get an opportunity to get in line. Hopefully, we'll get more funding. I know at least one side of the aisle is pushing hard to get that done. I think both want to get it done. I'm not going to get into politics. That never gets me anywhere. I just get in trouble. So for those who have actually received their funding or have been approved to get their funding, we have had a lot of questions that have come in about the forgiveness piece. How are we going to calculate that? And as we've seen with just the application process and the eligibility process, there probably going to be some more guidance that comes out. There better be some more guidance that comes out because we don't have a lot of certainty there. What we do know is, as I've shown here on this slide, payroll costs, mortgage interest or rent on your facilities, and utilities. We've had a lot of questions about, okay, what are qualified payroll costs, mortgage interest, rent, and utilities, and that sort of thing, especially when it comes to the rent and utilities. I've got a lot of questions there. And really the only guidance we can give you is the contracts or the loans had to be in place prior to 2/15 of 2020, that you're making those payments on during your covered period, your covered 8-week period after you receive your funding. And it's interesting in the guidance, the newest interim final rule that we got that on Monday, I think it was, that was guidance really for the self-employed individuals. They even said that rent or a lease payment on a business vehicle was qualified rent, and gas for your business vehicle was qualified as a utility. That's right in the guidance. That kind of surprised me, but I'd had questions before that came out from businesses, hey, we've got a lot of equipment rental. Does that qualify? Well, I haven't seen anything specifically that it does, but this newest guidance for self-employed individuals leads you to believe that it might. Bottom line is, and I'm going to continue to sing this refrain, Your lender is the one who's going to certify the information that you provided them after your 8-week period. They're going to need more guidance, but they're going to be the ones you're going to have to document your information to and convince them that the expenses were actually for qualified rent, utilities, mortgage interest, and payroll costs. And the payroll costs do include employer portion of fringe benefits such as healthcare costs and retirement contributions by the employer. So that had been a question as well. One of the most questions by far that we've had come in are, how can I maximize my forgivable piece by maybe manipulating the payments into that 8-week period, whether that be defer some things now until I get my money so it goes into my 8-week period, or accelerating by prepaying. So I guess I would say, and this is the accountant in me, I've done taxes and accounting for 30 years. Generally, you should continue to use the method of accounting that you've always used, whether that's accrual basis, cash basis, or what it is. But again, your banker's going to have to certify. Guidance we have right now doesn't say what basis of accounting, doesn't say whether it's generally accepted accounting principles, whether prepaid expenses are going to be allocated out of that period, whether expenses incurred but not paid yet are going to be included in that period. My best guess would be cash is king. And what you pay during that period is what's going to be used for the forgiveness calculation. I don't know that, haven't seen any specific guidance for that, and that's why we have a lot of people asking, hey, can I prepay my rent? Should I pay bonuses to the employees that I still have? Should I defer costs that I have now and wait and pay them in there? I think a lot of people will. I don't know that that's going to ultimately help you, but keep good accounting records. That's all I can say, because you're going to need to be able to document what those expenses were, what period they should have covered, and when they were paid. We also have had questions about the calculation. I think there is some confusion there about how you calculate any reductions. So first, the number you start with is what did you pay, or what expenses did you incur, what can be covered in that 8-week period. That's the maximum that you're going to have forgiven. And at least 75% of that needs to be for the payroll costs. Only 25%, up to 25%, can be for the other non-payroll cost items of mortgage, interest, rent, and utilities. And then those are reduced by two things: the pro rata reduction in your number of full-time equivalent employees, and full-time equivalent employees, that's not defined in the Act or in any of the guidance that we've seen, but generally, full-time employees means the number of employees that work 40 hours. So if you've got a 40-hour person per week that works 40 hours per week, that's 1 FTE. If they work 20 hours per week during that period, that's a half of FTE, and you aggregate that from before your covered period and during your covered period, and any reduction in that percentage of reduction will reduce the maximum forgivable amount by that percentage. And then the next reduction is for the amount of payroll cost below 75%. So it can drop, and it's pro rata again. I mean, it's an 8-week comparison of apples to apples, 8 weeks before and 8 weeks after, or during the covered period. And you can drop by 25%, but any drop below the 25% is dollar for dollar reduction in your forgivable piece. Just because it's not forgiven doesn't mean that it's not a benefit. You just are going to have to pay it back over the 2 years at 1%. We'll take more questions about that in our Q&A and maybe address some more specific things, but that's kind of the high level on those things. As far as the self-employed individuals who can now finally apply or could have as of by last Friday, assuming that their lenders were able to take those applications and process them and submit them for approval, we just got guidance on the 14th. Actually, maybe a little before that, but it was basically for self-employeds, the maximum that you're going to get is about $20,833. And that's based on the maximum self-employment income from your 2019 Schedule C or your 1099s. And you divide that, that's if you don't have employees. And that's the divide 100,000 by 12, take it times 2.5. So that's the max you're going to get. Plus then you can get the additional rent, utilities and that sort of thing. What you're going to have to provide for your lender when you do your applications, and again, we do recommend that you go ahead and continue to submit applications, assuming your lender will accept them, and I'm guessing most of them will, to get in line, because hopefully there will be more funding. But you're going to need to provide your Schedule C. Now, if you haven't filed your return because the 2019 returns have been extended to July 15th, you still need to go ahead and fill out a draft Schedule C and provide that to your lender, along with all the other normal information that we've talked about for submission for a PPP loan. But that's where your self-employment income is going to come from. If you are a sole proprietor that has employees, same thing. You're going to need your Schedule C for your piece of it, your up to 100,000 of your replacement of your income, and then also all your employment information, your 941s, your W-3, your W-2s, state unemployment, all those things that you normally would have to do for a PPP application. One other thing that came out, and I talked about some of the nuances as far as like rent and that sort of thing for self-employed individuals, but one other thing that came out, because there was a big question when the other organizations were applying if partner compensation was included for the partnership application, or if they were going to have to apply on their own as a self-employed individual. Partners cannot apply as their own application as self-employed individuals under the new guidance. They must be included, or their income up to $100,000 will be included on the partnership's application, which is what we thought should have happened all along, but unfortunately there was no guidance there. So a lot of partnerships applied for their loans, got approval, did not include their partner's compensation, and so their amount of their loan was limited to some degree. And the guidance that I've seen, or at least the most of the lenders that I've talked to, so you can't go back and revise that application. Once it's been approved, that's what it is. So first-time applications, if you're a partnership and you haven't applied yet, you can include the partner's self-employment income, whether that's guaranteed payments, in my opinion, or just their share of the profits that are subject to self-employment tax if they're a general partner.
Sure, John, let me just interrupt you real quick. You say partnerships, but that extends also to LLCs, or? Yeah,
LLCs taxed as partnerships, correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's great time to interrupt, George, because I think I'm done.
Okay.
John, did that guidance say anything about for partners, whether any retirement or health kind of stuff, or is it just the 100?
It didn't address it specifically, but it was pretty specific that it was just the 100,000, and even for self-employed individuals and partners, you don't get to add in your SE health insurance or your SEP contribution or something like that. So yeah, it's pretty much just limited to the comp.
Okay, great. All right, well, that's a great summary. And I think really the takeaway here for everybody is we're trying to give you information, hoping that this will open up again. But John, you did a good job of explaining what are some of the uses, how do you track the uses for those that have already been approved that will receive funds. So very, very informative. Thank you for that. All right, let's turn, Kate, you want to take a couple minutes. Last week we mentioned at the end of our seminar that there's a new package that's working its way through Congress that it has some additional programs to it that is called Main Street. So I wish there was better guidance on this. I'm going to give your disclaimer right up front. This is still in the works. We still are making sausage so to speak, in Congress with the Main Street lending program. But Kate, if you don't mind, take a couple minutes and just give some highlights of what are some of the things that we expect.
Sure. This is a new loan program that the Fed has put out some information on as of last week. I think it's $600 billion, kind of through two loan facilities. One is a new loan facility, one's an expanded loan facility. This kind of takes the SBA loans and builds on them and is an attempt to provide some relief for businesses up to 10,000 employees. The current Fed guidance doesn't indicate that there is a minimum number of employees, but I know that there's been some discussion about that this is going to be for companies with more than 500 employees, but the current Fed guidance really doesn't kind of set that low number. It just says eligible businesses up to 10,000 employees. And then it's got a revenue cap as well of $2.5 billion. So that what this is essentially allows your U.S.-based lenders to lend some money, and then the Fed will come in, and assuming that the borrowers have met all of these qualifications, the Fed will come in and participate in those loans at kind of a 95% rate. But these are, they start at $1 million. If it's a brand new loan, it's up to 25 million, or there's some other qualifications there. So these are not insignificant loans for your small and medium-sized businesses. Their new loans don't have to be secured. They have a 4-year term with amortization deferred for a year. You can also take existing debt and expand it in this program. You won't have to offer any collateral for the new portion of your loan, as I understand it. And your existing collateral will continue to secure just on a pro rata basis. There are some strings attached to this new available funding. You cannot, at least what they're telling us now, is you cannot use the funds to repay or refinance pre-existing loans. You will have to demonstrate some impact by the COVID situation, and like PPP, you'll have to make some reasonable efforts to maintain your payroll and retain your employees, but there's currently no indication that it's anything other than I certify I will make reasonable efforts to do so. As we've seen with PPP, everything could change with the next level of guidance. Additional strings to these funds, companies will be prohibited from stock buybacks, from paying dividends, and making other capital distributions until a year after the loan is no longer outstanding. And then there are some limitations on what can be paid out to your C-suite level folks. They are not, at this point, anticipated to be eligible for forgiveness. And if a company can qualify for PPP and more funds become available for PPP, if you qualify for both, you can apply for both. The Fed has indicated, they put this basic information out last week and indicated that they were taking feedback, comments, and questions through today. So I would expect that we will see some additional information and guidance coming soon. But in terms of rolling the program out for applications, I'd defer to Steve if they've heard anything else, but my understanding is that the banks haven't really heard anything as far as when this might be expected to roll out.
No, we were anticipating today, and we've not heard anything so far today. So we're still going to the exact same information you just gave Kate.
Okay. Great. Well, you know, I might, for those that don't live in the world that the five of us live in, it's common that when regulations like this come out, that they do have a comment period that they provide ahead of time. Had they done that with the PPP program, we wouldn't have had as much chaos as we've had, because, you know, the five of us, for instance, who kind of live in these worlds, could have looked at it and said, okay, now wait a minute, how about 1099s? How about self-employment? How about some of those things? But Congress pushed it out so quickly that they now are having to basically put Band-Aids on it on the backside. So that'd be one thing that I'm encouraged by, is that for Main Street, they are actually asking for comments ahead of time, which is closer to what they usually do. So hopefully they'll have a better piece of legislation that comes out this time, and we'll be able to provide more certain guidance on this.
And really, to follow on that, George, John's explanation of forgiveness, we're expecting the same thing over the next few weeks. As more questions are asked about forgiveness, we're going to continue to get guidance. So it's important to listen for those updates. We would expect by June to have a lot more guidance.
And are you saying that in respect to Main Street, Steve, or just across the board, every one of these, they're going to
the PPP, right? As we understand it, right, as written now, there won't be forgiveness available in the Main Street. And I saw in one of the questions, what do we mean by forgiveness? Well, if you follow the program, the loan could be turned into a grant, and you do not have to pay back. The principal is forgiven. Principal
Right.
and interest can be forgiven.
Right. You know, there's a question that we received that couples have talked about on the side about if there is forgiveness, what does the panel think about whether or not those expenses that the forgiven money has been used to pay will also be deductible? I don't think it's clear. I've looked for several places to see if those expenses could be deductible. Zach or John, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm sorry, say that again. I was reading questions, George.
Yeah, well, the question was, do you think that expenses that are paid by funds that are forgiven would also be deductible? I don't think it's clear at this point.
I don't think it's clear, but the way I've looked at it is the loan is forgiven, so that's revenue. And if the revenue is non-taxable, that doesn't necessarily mean that the expenditure is not deductible. That's just been my experience in most tax situations. So my answer right now would be, yeah, I'd anticipate that the expenses are going to be deductible. The loan forgiveness is not taxable as stated in the act. So you kind of get the best of both worlds there. And in a lot of cases, you're going to create a net operating loss, which that's another one of the provisions of the act. You can carry that back.
Right.
So that's where it stands right now. Always got to hedge a little bit. They could change that. They could say, well, we're not going to let you deduct the things that you spend your forgiven portion on because that's a double dip. But the way it stands right now, I think that's what my answer would be.
Got it. Yeah. And if it turns out that that is deductible, even better, right? If it's not deductible, hey, forgiven money is forgiven money. So I think everybody understands that.
Yeah, I think that's one of those that if it's not deductible, it's going to eat into the benefit sum, but it's still a whole lot better to have these than not have them. So
absolutely. Yep. I think everyone appreciates that. Okay. So Zach, since you're already lighted up here on my screen, you want to talk about tax deferrals that are part of the CARES Act?
Yep. So another provision that the CARES Act had, and this is a provision that is probably going to mostly be for businesses that weren't eligible for the PPP loans or weren't able to get approved for the PPP loan yet, or in the future. Then there's another opportunity under the CARES Act to help with cash flow, and that is a deferral of certain payroll taxes. So employers are required to pay a 6.2% Social Security employer share tax for each of their employees, as well as a 1.45% Medicaid share. The employee also has those same percentages that are withheld from their wages. The CARES Act allows a employer to defer the payment and deposit of the 6.2% Social Security tax for about 2 years, really. So any deposits that an employer has to make between March 27th and December 31st of 2020 can be deferred and not deposited until 1/2 by December 31st of 2021 and 1/2 by December 31st of 2022. So you still have to make your monthly or quarterly payment of the 1.45% Medicaid portion, and you still have to do the same thing that you always do with the employee withholding taxes, hold those in trust and deposit those over. But the employer share of the 6.2% can be deferred for a year or two for anything that you would have had to pay between those periods. The twist is that if you have a PPP loan forgiven, then you are not eligible for that deferral. But the IRS had said that in the interim period, so essentially between March 27th and the time where your PPP loan is forgiven, you can defer those. So, even if you have a PPP loan approved and funded today, you can still defer your payroll taxes until the point in time where you've applied with your lender for forgiveness and have been granted the forgiveness. So even if you have a PPP loan, you can take advantage of this for a short period of time. But if you don't get the PPP loan, then you have the opportunity to use it further down the line. It's also an opportunity if you are one of those, a self-employed person that wasn't able to get your application approved in time before they stopped taking the applications for the time being, then this would be an opportunity you could look at to potentially help with cash flow. Of course, there is the issue of, it's not forgiven. You do still have to pay it, so you need to make sure you're accounting for the ability to pay it by the end of 2021 and the end of 2022, because there are plenty of employers that have gotten in trouble by falling a little bit behind on employment taxes. It can be hard to catch up. So you want to be careful when doing this and make sure you have a plan for how to pay it off. But it can certainly help with your cash flow in the short term.
Okay. Right, and I think we all know that a lot of times this is some place that people look thinking that this is a good place to basically save some cash. There are caveats. There's great warnings against people not paying the government on withholding taxes. But if you're in that type of a cash crunch, I think this deferral program is one that's worth looking at. So that's a great summary. Okay, and right on the heels of that, we also there's another feature of the CARES Act that's the employee retention credits. This has some companion features to what Zach just talked about. Basically, what this is a program that gives fully refundable tax credits up to 50% of an employee's wages that are for the period of time starting last March 12th, and extends through the end of the year, really 12/31. There's a cap on this that is a maximum credit up to $5,000 per employee, and that credit is taken against what would be the Social Security taxes that would be paid for that employee. So who are eligible employers for this? Well, to start with, anyone whose business has been limited because of any of the shut-in orders, any guidance to not have group meetings, those are industries that probably would be on the call that would be eligible for this. There are other other businesses that would be eligible based upon what's happened to their gross receipts. So you basically would do through the rest of this year, you could do a quarter by quarter analysis. And if in any of those quarters, your gross receipts are 50% of what they were in the comparable quarter for the previous year, then that makes you eligible to take this tax credit. And it'll last if there's a recovery that occurs that's sufficient to where your quarter by quarter analysis between last year and this year, your revenues are off no more than 80%. Or in other words, you have 80% of the revenues you would have had a year ago on that comparable quarter. Then you're no longer an eligible employer for that. Unfortunately, like a lot of these things that we're seeing so far, Congress doesn't seem to give a whole lot of credit to people that are self-employed, because this is not available at this point to self-employed individuals. So then the question is, what does it mean to say that it's refundable? Well, if you have an employee who's, and you're an eligible employer, if you have an employee whose Social Security tax withholdings are less than $5,000, say somebody, their withholdings would be $8,000 through the year, 50% of that counts for this credit. Then if it's only $4,000 that they would receive and you have up to $5,000 that's a credit, well, then you can receive that additional amount, notwithstanding the fact that the employee, and particularly employee, only qualified for $4,000. That's what that means. The other thing, kind of like what Zach was talking about, these can be used actually through the year. If you want to talk to your accountant about trying to reduce what would be your withholding for employees in a current quarter, you can use this program to do that. So it might give you the ability to really get a little bit more cash flow. And then as I'm sorry to say, like some of these other things, if you do use PPP funds, this is not available to you. So, it's an interesting question. Now that PPP funds are not available, could somebody go ahead and take advantage of this employee retention credit and then come back and apply for the PPP afterwards if it's funded again? I don't have a good answer for that. My thought would be that if you were to do that, then basically you'd have to pay what would be the withholding for that employee as if you didn't have the credit. So anyway, it's just another tool that's out there. It's not applicable to everybody. Those of you who've already done PPPs and received funds, this is something that you're not eligible for. But for some of you that are out there who haven't taken advantage of that or didn't get the funding, this is yet one other thing that's out there that Congress has given us as a tool to hopefully give you some help.
George, I did see one question pop up on the tax deferral. Somebody had asked if you can defer deposits after your forgiveness, just not during that 8-week period. And I think the way it's written is once you get the loan forgiveness from the PPP loan, that kind of disqualifies you from the payroll tax deferral. So it's not just during that 8-week period. It's once
at any time.
Yeah, once you get the forgiveness, that's no longer an option, but it is an option up until the time you get forgiveness. So there's a little bit better answer on the tax deferral side than there is on the retention credit as to how it works if you try the retention credit now and the PPP loan later.
Right. Okay. Yeah, it's good clarity. Yeah, I wish there was more standardization to all these programs and all these answers. Okay, well, let's do this. Let's roll into some of the questions. I know we're all receiving questions along the way. For those of you who might have joined late, one of the things that we talked about early on is at this point, there is no more available funding under either the PPP program or the EIDL. Notwithstanding that, we're continuing to encourage everyone to to work with their bank to continue to do applications for these things, because we're hopeful that there'll be additional funding that comes along. Okay, so along the way, some of the questions that that we received, let me just hit a few of these. John, you talked a little bit about how you want to account for the amounts that are forgivable. One of the questions that came in, and I think it's going to be specific to how sophisticated somebody's bookkeeping is, would it make sense to set up a separate bank account so that somebody could easily sequester this and demonstrate in an audit that they actually have used the money appropriately?
Well, I've had that question quite a bit. As you said, it depends on your sophistication. I think a good accounting system, I mean, cash is a fungible thing. Cash is, whether it's in one account or another, it is what it is. So I would say it's not necessary. For some, it might be better for them to do that so that they can just maybe transfer that then directly into their payroll account. Let's say they've got an account that they just paid their payroll out of. They use ADP or AGH or some other payroll provider, and they transfer money into that and have it directly withdrawn from that account. That might be something that they felt good about. I call it belts and suspenders. You've got some assurance that yeah, my money went directly to that payroll account and that's all I used it for. So that's something to consider, but I don't know that it's necessary.
Right. Yeah. Steve, do you have any thoughts on that, since you're the ones that set the accounts up?
Right. We agree with John's position. We don't require them to set up a separate account for the funds. And especially along the way, it's been advised that you work with your current bank. So most folks have the operating account ready to go. So I would say we're within the 50-50 range. And it really is based on the businesses, how they feel comfortable. But we have seen quite a few open accounts, and I think it just gives them comfort that they can later go back and audit that directly, but we're not requiring it. No, you can put it into an existing operating account. And again, there's two ways typically they've offered three ways to get the money out. One of those includes the cashier's check. And of course, in these shutdown times, we're having difficulty getting it out that way. So most folks are either depositing it directly into their existing account or wiring it somewhere.
Right. So we've gotten a number of questions that have come in. Apparently there's a number of folks who have LLCs where they don't really have many employees, but the members themselves are the ones who really are involved in the business. What guidance? There's not a lot that I see that's available to those folks currently. What guidance would we give to somebody who says, hey, I know there's all kinds of programs that are out there. How about in our situation? We might have a bookkeeper, but there's 4 or 5 of us who really are members of this LLC. What program should we look for?
Well, I still would take it in the hierarchy that we've discussed. Is if you can get if they fund more PPP loan availability and you can get in line and get a PPP loan, I think that's your best deal. Now, because you're an LLC, and I'm assuming you're going to be taxed as a partnership, so your members, assuming they're general partners or members, they're going to be subject to self-employment tax. So the self-employment income up to $100,000 is their comp that is eligible for the PPP loan application calculation, plus the bookkeeper you talked about and their payroll. So they still have that opportunity, but if one, they've already applied and didn't do that, or don't ever get that funding, then as Zach and you talked about, I think you look to those other programs to see what you can do. Unfortunately, you don't have a lot of payroll, then you don't have a lot of credits or deferral to help you there. So then hopefully, as Kate talked about, they allow smaller entities in the Main Street lending program. And you still can go to your lender when they finally get some time after all this and do normal SBA loans as well.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
I don't know that anybody else got anything. I'm just guessing there.
No, I think that's good guidance. One of the other a couple questions we've gotten, not-for-profits, I think, are struggling also at this point in time. Let's talk a minute about eligibility of not-for-profits for these programs. I know 501c3s by definition are eligible. There's several others. I know I've seen programs that are for veterans that apply. There's railroad workers and some programs that must have great lobbyists because they've got some qualifications for things. Any particular guidance for not-for-profits that, again, might be scratching their head trying to figure out what, if any?
I would say that we have seen approvals for not-for-profits across the board, 501c3s. We've seen numerous approvals. Again, I caution right now because the SBA is not taking applications at the program as we know it, but assuming it was to achieve new funding and without a lot of changes, we got several 501c3s. So if they're out there, I would encourage them to talk to their banker. We haven't had much difficulty getting most 501c3s through with employees.
Okay.
And my understanding is just 501c3s and 501c19, which is the veterans organizations, not any of the other organizations, fraternal organizations, you know, the 501c6s, community organizations, things like that. Unfortunately, I don't think they're covered under the PPP loan apps.
Right. Yeah. So that apply like to educational organizations, fraternal organizations, all those. Yeah.
Right.
So just so people know, they don't waste any time trying to get something that's not going to be available to them. So what are some of the other questions here that you all are getting? I know all our phones are fairly busy with people asking much more detailed questions. What are some other general questions that we could maybe throw out and answer for some of the folks online with us?
I think a big one that I've been getting is how to calculate the employee side of it. So for the PPP loan, you have to maintain your average payroll during the 8-week period. You know, how do you calculate those as far as full-time employees or part-time employees? And I don't know if there's a very crystal clear answer on how that calculation is going to go. I know, you know, it says that you have to calculate your average number of employees during either February 15th of 2019 through June 30th of 19, or January 1st of 20 through February 29th of 20. And then you have to maintain that average during your 8-week window. But I haven't seen anything yet on how to handle part-time employees for that calculation, or if that even matters. I don't know. John, have you seen anything on that side of it?
I'm sorry, say that again. I was again reading other questions.
No problem. The maintaining your full-time employment levels. I think it says you have to maintain the same number of full-time employees in the statute and the regs, but I haven't seen anything on how to handle part-time employees, or if you just kind of disregard them or accumulate them.
For the PPP or for the credits?
For the PPP.
Well, my understanding is they're going to look at FTEs. So, and as I was just reading there were several questions about, okay, well, how do we calculate FTEs? And in the application, they just asked for total number of employees. Well, that application is pretty darn brief. They wanted proof that you had employees as of February 15th, 2020. And so that was really the number they were just asking for, and then get the lender to get some documentation to prove that you were in business and you had employees as of 2/15/20. As far as FTEs go, yeah, part-time people matter, and that's why in our previous webinar I discussed, you know, the possibility of doing the shared work program with the state of Kansas, maybe working your employees less than full time, but getting them some unemployment, which that's another matter. I know the antiquated IT for the state unemployment people is causing a huge problem there. But so yes, full-time equivalents is what they're going to look at in the measurement period, whether that be in 19 or early 20, compared to the covered period, the 8-week period.
Let's talk briefly about, so somebody, they qualify, the whole point of the PPE is to keep people employed, right? Try to keep them off of unemployment. So let's talk briefly about strategies for our listeners. If they have, there's an 8-week period here that, again, the government's trying to get people to keep their employees employed. What strategies would we give to people through that 8-week period? And then also, is there anything that we would advise them at the end of the 8-week period if they're no longer getting this kind of stimulus? Well, I'll throw out. I guess my advice would be that, again, the intent of the program, particularly if you get PPP funds, is to try to keep as many of these people employed as you can. Once you're through that period of time, there's really no guidance here. There's no applicability that's clear of what you do with the employees after that. Anybody else want to take a shot at that? Because I know it came up several times in our questions.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go ahead and say what I think, and that gets me in trouble sometimes. But as you said, the spirit of the act is to keep people employed as much as we can, or at least getting a paycheck through this period. We don't know how long it's going to be. Obviously, Trump wants to open up the economy May 1st, if not before. States are fighting against that possibly. We don't know what's going to happen. But this act, the original funding and hopefully more funding, is to keep as many people getting a paycheck as possible. That's why they called it the Paycheck Protection Act. So while I understand that it's the nature of most entrepreneurs to try and maximize any benefit they possibly can, and that's certainly what we always try to do as a consultant and an advisor. Let's try and keep as many people getting a paycheck as we can. And I had questions such as, should we give a large bonus to someone during this period? Well, I guess if they deserve it, if they worked hard maybe prior to this, and you had promised them a bonus, and you want to go ahead and pay them their bonus during that period, and it happens to benefit you in your forgiveness calculation, sure, why not? But to artificially bump someone's salary up, I'd be real careful. Again, as I've said before, the bank, your lender, is going to have to certify to the SBA, and they're going to have to then forgive the amount. If they see that you're maybe trying to circumvent the spirit of the act, they may not want to do that. It's a little bit of a balancing act, but that's just my opinion. And I think, you do your best to keep as many people getting a paycheck during this period as you can. And then if you need to prepay some rents because, you want to, I don't know that that's a bad thing, because, then you're going to be able to stay in your facility for a little while. I think all those things are necessary, and you need to do them, but I'd be very cautious in trying to do too much to maximize my forgiveness if it somehow defeats the spirit of the act.
Sure. So we're really kind of talking about, John, are things that would really be reasonable business expenditures outside of this, this virus and the quarantine.
Mm-hmm.
I had a physicians group that I had this discussion with the other day, who have, some of their people who really are putting themselves more in danger now than they did before. And as we talked about it, I told them, look, there's no guidance on it that's clear. But, I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to pay them what basically would be combat pay.
Yeah, hazard pay, sure.
Yeah. And I think that would be one. As you said, another one would be maybe prepaying some rent if it's going to make sure that you're able to have space available when things come back to normal. So it's kind of it's a reasonable operator standard almost. It's something where what would somebody expect they would do reasonably outside of this? But again, it's not clear. It's a case by case thing. What I'd suggest everyone do is, call your banker, call your accountant, call your attorney, and bounce it off them, because I think some third party helping you decide whether that's reasonable or not is a good idea, because I think there's all kinds of things that are reasonable that apply to me that if I check with somebody else, they might discourage me from doing.
Of course, I'm going to agree with you guys. I'd love to hear the professionals answering that way as well. Right now, we're like John said, we're sticking to a pretty strict definition. You have 8 weeks to spend it. The spirit is to spend it on payroll. We realize you have 25% of it that you could spend on other, but just be careful. We do realize that sometimes that you're only going to bring somebody back for 20 hours. They used to work 40. We'll get more and more guidance on that as time goes, I'm sure. But remember, if it's not forgiven, it does convert. I saw a question about that. It does convert. You have 6 months interest only at just the 1%. It's a 2-year loan, 1%. I've not heard any. I saw a rumor in there that banks were going to call that note. I had not heard anything like that to this point.
Yeah, I don't know if that being the case either, Steve.
Yeah, we're all in it for to figure it out.
Right. Okay.
So does that mean, I've had several people asking about, I have some employees at home that, do I just keep paying them their full wage, even though, they don't really have any tasks that they can do very remotely. But, we have some people in the office, but some people are at home. Should we just keep paying them their wages like we normally do? And I haven't seen anything. I think that's probably okay for them to do. As long as you're paying them at least minimum wage, that's the only thing you have to do. So if you're paying them I wouldn't be, increasing their pay substantially, but if you're paying them what they've always made, even if they're at home through this, I think that's kind of the spirit of it.
Hey, Zach, I'll add that I have seen, and maybe John has seen it as well. I've seen some suggestion that restaurants who employ tipped workers can bump up pay under this program and have that fully forgivable to cover what they would have otherwise made through tips.
Right.
So that they are not being paid to whatever they get paid per hour, but they're actually receiving some real or close to real wage during this time. And even though their prior payroll wouldn't reflect those levels of payment, that it's something that is, to our previous point, reasonable to do in this particular circumstance and keeping people paid.
Right. Yeah.
I think another question that I've seen several times is, how long do we keep them employed for this? Is it the 8-week period? Is it June 30th? Do I have to keep them employed past June 30th or whatever that date is? And I haven't, the only requirement I've seen is for forgiveness, you keep them employed through the 8 weeks. And, for the exception for rehiring people that you've laid off during a certain window, it's rehire by June 30th. But I haven't seen anything saying that you can't take this loan, keep them employed through whatever date at latest June 30th, and then, essentially do what you got to do in July for your business. I haven't seen anything mandating keeping anybody on payroll past that, at least at latest June 30th date.
Well,
not under the current program.
Sure.
That's what's next.
Under the current program, yeah. It could change tomorrow.
And the consequence is that if you do, then you've got a 2-year loan really at 1%. So there's, a lot of that gets into just how do you want to run your business and how do you want to treat your employees. So I get that.
Some of that is, hopefully by doing this, you're able to maintain the employment levels through that date. And then maybe things are somewhat back to normal by that time to where you can maintain the payroll numbers through relatively normal operations.
Sure. Yeah.
And just a caution on, we talked about, okay, well, if it's not forgivable, then it's just a loan. And there still are regulations or at least definitions in the act of what you can actually spend that money on. And you can't, like, for instance, go out and pay off other debt with it. You need to be able to show you spend it on payroll, existing interest interest on existing debt, rent, that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah.
Even
John,
after the 8-week period.
yeah, John, that's really a great catch, so that people understand that whatever the amount is that they receive here, they're going to have to account for it, right? Whether it's something that's going to be refundable or not, they're going to have to account for it one way or the other, whether it's for use or for forgivability. So, yeah, that's a great catch. Okay. All right. So, hey, we're right at 1 hour here. Does anybody have anything that they want to offer to our listeners that we may not have touched on so far?
Well, I want to just make sure that everybody understands. I said several times, your lender's going to be the one to make this decision. Your lender's going to be the one to certify. I'm not trying to pass the buck to lenders. That's just unfortunately the way it is. I've got a lot of friends and acquaintances that I've had over the years that are bankers. They're working their tails off right now. I know Steve is, and all his group at CrossFirst. They're your friends. You need to work with them. And when push comes to shove, you need to ask them some of these questions, because they're the ones who hopefully are going to get some guidance, and they're the ones who are going to evaluate your application for forgiveness and whether or not you spent your money the way you should have. So work with them.
You
I
bet.
appreciate that, John. Thanks. Of course, I support that. And yeah, speak for my fellow bankers when I say, then be patient with us, because we're expecting that guidance to come out, as we've learned over the next couple of months. But we'll do the best we can and help guide into it. And again, I think probably just to wrap up, make sure everybody understands that, remember, your banker, even after you've got that SBA number, has 10 days to fund, 10 calendar days to fund that loan. So even if you haven't gotten your money yet, that's probably not unusual. Everybody worked really hard to get you the SBA numbers, and now the funding has to come. So it's not unusual that you didn't get the money the next morning.
Yeah, I might add one more practical tip for people. And again, I'm not trying to expand your workload, Steve, but I've talked to a fair number of clients and friends who have tried to do some of these applications on their own. And they have great frustrations. People that have tried to submit applications 3 and 4 times, they just don't have them quite right for some reason. I really would recommend reach out to your banker. If your bank doesn't do this kind of work, there's some that aren't SBA lenders, right? There's some that have decided they're not going to participate in these programs. Then check with some of your friends and see what banks are out there that do it, because I know how frustrating, we all know how frustrating it is to fill out federal applications for things. So instead of frustrating yourself, pick up the phone and call somebody. Call your accountant, call your attorney, get a referral, or call your banker and just see what they have. Because we've all some of us already thought about this stuff. And hopefully we can save you some frustration.
I agree with that advice. Yeah, it was supposed to be designed as usual to be simple, but don't get hung up on a question and hold back on the application. Call. And really the bankers, we're lucky here in Wichita. Got a lot of good bankers that can answer the question. I joked earlier that, but I'd be happy to take the call and direct as needed.
Right. Okay. You're a great delegator.
I am.
All right, folks. Well, hey, listen, thanks again for sitting in with us. I hope that this was, we all hope that this was helpful for you. And we given the hiatus we're here with funding, not quite knowing what's going to happen with Main Street, we are completely open to doing this again. I'm not going to try to suggest when we might do it, but watch for an invitation from us, because I think we're all getting more and more comfortable with a lot of these topics. We're happy to help guide you through this very difficult period of time. So watch your email inboxes, and I expect that we're going to do this again in the not too distant future. So, hey, listen, thanks again, everybody. Thanks for the participants, Kate and John and Zach and Steve. Thank you for your contributions this morning.
Hey, if we didn't get to answer your question, as long as it's not too specific, shoot me an email. I don't know. I don't know if my contact information was out there or not, but shoot me an email and I'll try to answer it as best
Yeah,
I
I
can.
think we put all of our contact information really on the PowerPoint, so everyone should have it. I think we all feel that way. Zach and Kate and I and Steve. If you've got a question you think that we're likely to be able to answer, we'll sure give it our best shot.
Yeah.
All right, thanks everybody.
We will get the video uploaded to the Martin Pringle website as well as the PowerPoint, and we'll get that out, a link to those things out to everybody who registered.
That's great.
Thank
Okay,
you.
well, hey, thank
Thanks,
you.
guys.
Be safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.